Well, it's almost Christmas, so that means we're all merry and bright, right? Uh-huh. Or not. I mean, for many of us, this is a tough time of year, actually. If you go and look on WebMD or the Mayo Clinic's website, you find resources specifically to help people cope with holiday stress and depression, because these are, honest to God, public health concerns. I mean, you know this. That stress and pain can come from lots of different places, from the intensity of our schedules, or our expectations of ourselves, or maybe our expectations of others, the folks we can't change but sure want to. And, of course, it can also come from having lost somebody you love, or having lost a relationship, or struggling with depression generally. It can be hard to keep smiling through what is supposed to be the most wonderful time of the year, you know. Even for those of us who are quite talented at proclaiming in the midst of our struggles, it's all good. Except sometimes it's not. And that's all right. Anyway, you know all that. You know that life can be tough and that the holidays don't necessarily help. But maybe more surprising is what we heard in the gospel reading just a minute ago, that life actually became tough enough even to shake the faith of John the Baptist. Now, just last Sunday, we heard John in all of his prophetic certainty, railing against the Romans and the Jewish religious leaders, calling them to recognize the presence of God's true king and to practice justice and to get ready for the judgment to come. Well, this morning, 8 chapters later in Matthew's gospel, we find John languishing in King Herod's prison with no hope of justice for himself. So John's in prison because Herod is afraid. Herod has his ear to the ground and he hears the rumbling of a coming rebellion. His one job as Caesar's functionary in Palestine is to keep the peace. So Herod throws John in prison. And we don't know how long John's been there at this point in the story, but it must have been some time. Because we hear John say the very last thing we would expect from the one who was announcing the coming of the Messiah with all that vim and vigor. From prison now, he sends his friends to ask Jesus, "Are you really the one who is to come, or are we to wait for another?" You know, so much for prophetic certainty, right? Whatever has happened to John in prison, his spirit is broken. And at this point, he's not sure whether Jesus is king or not. So if you're feeling a little less than merry and bright this time of year, don't feel too badly, because you're in good company. Even for John the Baptist, the curtains of darkness were closing over hope. But here's the thing. We can't let fear and sorrow have the last word. And we heard that actually in the first reading. Go back to the Old Testament reading from Isaiah. Last week, also a reading from Isaiah, but that text last time was from the time of the defeat of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, when the once great empire of David and Solomon had been cut to a stump. Well, today's Isaiah reading comes from a few decades later, from the period of the exile in Babylon, when God's people were languishing in a foreign land and aching to come home. And in that time of desperation, when the people must have thought that God had abandoned them, the prophet again comes back with hope. "Here is your God," Isaiah says. "He will come and save you." In fact, God will bring the people home, back to Palestine, by a road opened up across a desert, a way made straight through the trackless wastes of what we would now know as Iraq and Saudi Arabia. And no one in his right mind would travel that way. But don't worry, the prophet says. You will, in fact, travel that way, because waters will spring up in that desert, and you won't die of thirst along the way. The wild beasts won't even harm you, he says. But the redeemed will walk there, those whom God has liberated from the despair of exile. And in the power of that liberation, the prophet says, God will heal the spiritual disabilities of the people. And we heard about it actually in both readings. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. And the lame shall leap like a deer, and the tongue of the speechless sing for joy. Now the people of Israel are sitting there in captivity in Babylon, asking God, really? Are you really going to come and save us? And God says, despite what you see, yes, I am your deliverer. I am your healer. I am your king. Just watch. And Jesus picks up that same refrain with the followers of John the Baptist when they come to talk to him. They ask, are you the one who is to come, or shall we wait for another? And Jesus says, look around. Go and tell John the Baptist what you see and hear. Well, what would that be? Well, for the previous 7 chapters of Matthew's gospel, Jesus has been curing all kinds of diseases and teaching huge crowds and performing miracles and sharing even with his followers the power to heal and to cast out demons and to proclaim the kingdom at hand, despite the persecutions that work brings. So Jesus says, go and tell John what you see and hear. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk, and the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised, and the poor have good news preached to them. So, yes, he says, despite what you see, despite persecution, despite John rotting in prison, despite even the cost that will come to Jesus himself, yes, he says, I am your deliverer. I am your healer. I am your king. Just watch. And don't let fear have the last word. Of course, that's kind of hard to pull off in this world we know, from our national life to our personal lives. There is plenty to keep us up at night. The news tells us, and not only do our leaders seem unable to work together, they don't even seem to be living on the same planet. And even in a strong economy, millions of people still struggle to feed their kids or risk losing their homes. Illnesses afflict us, and death comes knocking, even at Christmas time. But in that all too real strife, Jesus says, choose what you're going to pay attention to. For God is at work even in the hardest times. And I can give you a couple of examples even. So, as you know, most of you know, parishioner Bill Meeker died a couple of weeks ago with no warning. A day, in fact, after having come to worship here. Now, in a sense, going suddenly is a great way to go. But on the other hand, it doesn't provide time to tie up loose ends. And I'm not telling any secrets in saying that Bill could be a challenging person to relate with, right? That's okay to chuckle. That is all right. Because I have been struck in the past couple of weeks by the number of people who've come up to me and said something along the lines of, I just had a great conversation with him. Or, we were really making progress. Or, we'd finally been able to clear the air. Or, and this is a direct quote, I just loved that guy. That is blessing, even in the darkness. And here's another. So I know a family struggling with a grave illness. Death is going to come soon, and they know it. But in the midst of trying to make peace with that, the person who's sick was focused on being sure that a message of thankfulness got to his friends, letting them each know how important they had been to him across the years. That is blessing, even in the darkness. And here's another. I know somebody struggling with the prospect of losing his home. He's been fighting a long time to keep it, but the odds are not good. Yet in this drama, he noticed that somebody on the other side of the legal issues had actually taken a step in his interest, trying to give him every chance to resolve the issue favorably, even though there was no incentive. In fact, just the opposite incentive for the other person to behave that way. That's blessing, even in the darkness. And here's one more. I can predict for you something that is going to happen this Saturday when we offer the free store at Grace and Holy Trinity. And those of you who have been to this event in the past, you know this. Hundreds of people will be served Christmas dinner, and they'll have the chance to shop from a variety of coats and hats and boots and gloves and all that good stuff to help them stay warm this winter. And I can tell you how several of those conversations are going to go. People from St. Andrews will be sitting at tables with them, having lunch, or helping them shop through the free store afterwards. And we'll turn to the guest next to us and ask something like this question: how are you doing? Because what else do you ask, right? How are you doing? And I guarantee that we will hear this response back: I am blessed. I am blessed. That's an astonishing response. Even in poverty, even in the darkness, I am blessed. A big part of getting ready for the coming of our Savior and King is deciding what we're going to see and hear. So I would just encourage you in the next couple of weeks to look for the thirsty ground that God is watering to bring you out of spiritual exile. Pay attention to what you learn from reporters of hope rather than those who profit from driving us further apart in fear. Seek the healing presence of people around you, the people who love you, in those moments when life brings you pain. And then go and be a reporter yourself. Go and report good news that you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, after all, and the lame walk, and the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised, and those who are poor in so many senses have good news brought to them. We do find ourselves in exile sometimes, but death doesn't get the last word. Because as Isaiah said, the ransomed of the Lord shall return and come home with singing, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away.